Okay, so our last video on Polygon mesh modeling for now is going to be using this sculpting function in Blender, which is really powerful and again, one of these things that I can show you the basics about how to use, but the only way to get a feel for it is going to be to experiment on your own quite a bit with all the different brushes and see how they work. So let's start with a monkey mesh. And let's tab, first of all, the one thing about sculpting, it's pretty intuitive for one thing, but it works best with models that have a decent level of detail. So this is a very low poly or low polygon mesh, the Suzanne head. So in we're going to get into several ways to do what's called subdividing, which we briefly touched on before, which is just adding vertices, kind of dividing the existing vertices and adding vertices in between. So with the whole thing selected, right, so you've got the whole thing, press A to select all the head, just right click and hit subdivide. Okay, it adds subdivisions along all the existing geometry. Right click and do it again. So let's add, let's start with this. Yeah, let's start with this. So subdivide it twice, and then tab again to go to object mode. And let's right click and choose shade smooth. So we're going to start with a somewhat smooth version of the head. It's still chunky, but it's better, and will give us a very good way of looking at the sculpt tool. So at the top of your screen, sculpting tab. There's layout, modeling, sculpting. Just hit the sculpting tab. So when you do this, the default screen you enter into is a little simplified. You get a different looking cursor. We're going to talk about how to use that. And but navigating is the same. Middle mouse click, rotating around the object, etc. Now notice that when you, just by default, this Blender does this by default, which I think is sort of strange, but I guess a lot of modeling is symmetrical. So when you move your mouse around without clicking, you notice that I've got this left blue circle, and on the right you see a blue dot. It's mirrored by default. The very first thing we're going to do is move over to the right hand side and open up the window that says symmetry, because by default the x-axis symmetry is on. So if you click on the y-axis, you'll notice that y-axis symmetry is on, and z-axis. So turn off all of the mirroring. So we really just got one thing to work with and one thing to worry about at this point, because there's a lot to go over. Okay, on the left is this entire massive list of different brushes in sculpting and things that they do with titles. We'll go over most of them. Again, I think it's more important that you experiment on your own with a lot of these, but we are going to talk about some basic things and how to customize each one independently. So the very first shortcut, it's super important no matter which one of these you have selected. By default, it's the first one called Draw, is the letter F as in Frank on your keyboard. When you hit F and you move your mouse to the right, you drastically increase the size of your brush. When you hit F and move to the left, you decrease the size of your brush. So whatever you do at any of the sculpting tools, you're going to be using F a lot. So clicking once to get into it and then clicking out of it when you select the size. The other shortcut is right-clicking within the sculpt menu gives you the radius, which is exactly what we just did by hitting F. You can increase and decrease the radius here too, but it also gives you the access to the strength of the brush, but that also shows up here on the right. The radius, strength, and then we'll talk more about this thing that says direction, etc. So all the brushes, you'll get a lot of redundancy. You get the info here, right-clicking, you get the info here. Okay, so let's decrease our radius. Now, let's just, with the draw tool, it's really, some of the tools are a kind of click and drag thing where you click and drag and it continues to move and move and move. And some of them you need to click multiple times. So I think with the draw tool, I'm just gonna single click and just start clicking along, you know, this brow ridge or something. It doesn't matter at all where you do this, just so you can see what it's doing. It is pulling the mesh that you're clicking outward for one thing, right? So this is a kind of sculpting that's happening by pulling rather than pushing. Some of them will be pushing and some of them will be pulling, smoothing, creasing, all sorts of stuff. All right, so we'll get increasingly more complicated here, but two interesting shortcuts when you're within a tool. If you hold down the control key, you will basically do the opposite of what you were doing. So instead of pulling out, it's now taking the same tool and the same function, but it's depressing. It's pressing in on the surface. So I'm clicking around and I can right click and I can decrease the strength of what I'm doing and increase the radius. And let's say make a big flat area here, right? So you can do that. Okay, so yeah, that's increasing, decreasing. If you hold down the shift button, it does something slightly different. It smooths the area out. It kind of takes whatever you've done that seems like some kind of harsh, actually you can go into an area that, let's say, you haven't done anything to here, and if you hold down shift, you're going to be, you know, decreasing the level of sharp edges, put it that way. This is a sharp edge here. Holding down shift will smooth that out. It might be desirable, it might not, right? Depends on what you're doing. Okay, so that's the draw tool, both shift and control to have different effects. Now the big one here is this thing called dynamic topographics, or DYNTOPO. When you check this box, you get a warning. Vertex data detected, topo will not preserve vertex colors. Okay, just hit OK, doesn't matter. And if you open up the window, you get some options. The interesting thing about this is that it creates more geometry when you sculpt. If you don't have this on, the best way to look at this is if you go to Z and go into wireframe mode. Yeah, let's go into wireframe mode. Or yeah, this is probably the best way to do it. Maybe let's see if X-ray mode looks better. No, let's go into wireframe mode. Z wireframe. All right. So if you don't have this thing selected, dynamic topographics, and you hit this draw tool and you just keep kind of clicking here, you notice that it's just stretching the vertices. It's just stretching what's there. Stretch, click, stretch. So at a certain point, that can cause you know, the mesh to get pretty distorted and maybe start creating some issues with how well the mesh is constructed. Okay, so that's, now if I turn this on and I do this, now as soon as I click, notice that it adds a ton of geometry. So this can be good and bad. It allows you with certain tools that we have to sculpt in a much more I guess much more smooth way, in an organic way, but it also creates a ton of geometry and can slow down rendering and all sorts of processes within Blender. So just be careful with this. I would say for now use the default of 12. The lower number means the more detail. So if you brought this down to 6, for instance, and you clicked, you create a lot more mesh. If I bring it down to 3 and I click once, you see it creates tons and tons of detail. So be real careful with this. So I'm going to undo that. Command Z a bunch of times. Okay, so I'm going to put this back to 12. All right, let's go back into solid mode. Now, you can also, when you have dynamic topographics selected, you can click on smooth shading here so that we can simulate the smooth shading that we had before. Okay, so let's get to some of the other tools. I'm going to skip draw sharp. Clay we can click on. Again, you know, some of these, this is with topographics on. Do things that feel very similar to the other tools, and they only kind of show up when you really do something very specific, either with a small or a large brush. This clay strips one, for instance, creates a kind of, so if you use a small brush here, let's say like this, and it kind of creates these like strips, I guess. Right? So depending on what you're modeling, you can create, so it's taking, yeah, taking the existing geometry and kind of exaggerating where the ridges are. Layer, I'm gonna leave out. I actually, out of inflate and blob, I find blob way more useful. So with blob selected, let's try something here. So right here, this, we're gonna create this kind of, I don't know, this offset horn. So when you click and drag, or sorry, click, you know, and continue to click, you, with this tool, you kind of create this growth, right? So you can just keep clicking, and because you've got dynamic topographics selected, you're not simply stretching the geometry. If you go back into wireframe mode, you see that you're adding geometry where it's necessary. So I'm going to just create, I'm just clicking a bunch of times. Right, I can go into F here, or sorry, I can right click and increase the strength. And you can play around with some of those other functions, but you can see that this is a quite, you know, the results are pretty dramatic here. So I created this weird, and get smaller, create this weird horn on this thing. Okay. So remember that if I hold down Shift, I kind of smooth out what I've done. And if I hold down Control, I basically do the opposite. So instead of pulling out this blob, I'm pushing it in wherever I'm clicking. So you gotta be careful, don't get too. So again, anytime you want to smooth out what you did, hold down Shift. All right, so you can see how you could find some use for that. Crease tool, pretty interesting. If you click it, let's say back here, and get a smaller one, and just keep painting back and forth. Let's see if I can get it to be a little more dramatic. Right click, increase the strength. There we go. So with increased strength, you can kind of create this pretty dramatic crease in the object, right? You can, like a cavity. That's pretty interesting. And again, dynamic is on, so you can do it without stretching the mesh too much. You're just adding mesh. And then hold down Shift if you feel like some of these edges are too sharp. You can smooth it out. Or you can hold down Control and kind of do the opposite of what you were doing. It should start to pull out the info instead. All right, good. Play around with this tool as well. Okay. Yeah, and you could go along a kind of, you know, something else you'd made, and you can create a crease here, you know, by just going down to the base of this and created. All right, so some of these other things are going to start to feel a little bit redundant. Smooth brush in itself, flatten. Some of these are a little self-explanatory. I don't want to spend a ton of time going over each one. These ones that are yellow, snake hook and elastic deform, can be really destructive to the model, so you got to be very careful with them. So if I make this big, and if I just click and drag this snake hook, you notice that it just really messes stuff up quickly. It kind of curves. But you could start with it. You know, you could do something, I would say, more subtle with it, but I don't think that it's all that great. And the elastic deform a little bit better, actually. You can kind of really start to pull this thing like elastic and shape where it is, kind of move it in larger areas. If I hit F and make this bigger, almost move the whole thing, right? Kind of pressing the whole thing in one direction or another. Right, good. Okay, those are those. Gonna skip the thumb. Pose is pretty cool. Pose is pretty interesting. It so if I go into the one mode on my number keypad, straight on front facing, notice that you got this weird kind of line. It allows you to position or pose the whole mesh, but be careful here. Look at it's breaking this already. So I say use it with caution. I don't know how to fix that. Oh, okay, it was just a glitch. But you could take this whole thing, so it's causing this, but if I click over here, it seems to fix it. Oops. So if I reduce the size, and I just wanted to change the direction of this thing, you can play around with the strength and the yeah, and you notice that you might start causing cracks, but it looks like for me here that all I'm doing, oh oops, I can repair those things maybe with holding down the shift key to smooth things out. Looks like that's working. And repair any holes in the mesh that you might have inadvertently created. So pretty cool tool, actually. Right. I wouldn't worry. These kind of do ridiculous things. Rotate takes whatever you have. I can't imagine finding use for this, but I guess, and it kind of creates a rotation, so be real careful with that. Simplify will, it's the next tool down. If you go into wireframe mode and you hit the simplify button, this is will actually reduce the number, the mesh that you have here. So let me see if I can make this work. I have to turn this off for this tool. So theoretically, we should be reducing the mesh by hitting simplify. It doesn't seem like it's working properly. Maybe make the, so yeah, somewhat. I don't know. This isn't working the way I expected it. Maybe I'm in the wrong tool. That's why, duh. Okay. Redo. Take two. Let's increase the strength. And this still isn't working right. Well, I'm not sure why. The simplify tool should definitely be reducing the mesh. Okay. Back to, solid mode. On the masking tool, this is an interesting one. Masking is a way for you to sort of preserve part of the mesh if you don't want to mess with it, and then model around it. So with the mask tool selected, and let's bring our strength all the way to 100 so we can really see it, and you paint, it kind of turns black. It doesn't kind of turn black, it turns black. So I'm going to kind of preserve this area of the crease I made. And now I'm going to go back into, let's go back into this blob mode. And I'm going to paint along here. Now, where if I paint in the black area, nothing happens. It's protected, basically. But if I paint around it, as soon as it can do what you want it to do, it will. So I'm going to turn back on this dynamic thing. Yeah, so you see I'm creating this. I can smooth it out. Hold down S, smooth it back out. And then if you hit Alt M, as in Mary, Alt M, you remove the mask from the area that you just affected. So masking can be pretty useful if you want to preserve details somewhere. What else? I think I'm gonna leave it there and have you play on your own and make your own ridiculous distorted monkey.